Hey everyone, I wanted to check in with you now that I've finished reading through all of the discussion contributions for the Module 2 discussion. I'm a little behind on that, but I really enjoyed reading all of your thoughts on how revolutions are defined, different issues to keep in mind, and the different perspectives that were presented by the various theorists and scholars that we read for that particular exercise last week. Before I make a few comments on what we said in that discussion, I just wanted to put it out there again that if you need any help with the timeline, that's what we're working on currently this week. We're in Module 3. If you have any questions, you're not quite sure what to do with it, or even if you're having technical issues with either Tiki-Taki or Timeline.js, don't hesitate to contact me. I'm more than happy to help out. We're using a digital tool here to hopefully find an engaging and interesting way to create living narratives of the revolutions that we are going to study this semester. And as some of us kind of alluded to in the Module 2 discussion, we don't really have any historical examples to draw from yet, except maybe the American Revolution or a couple of others that we already are somewhat familiar with. So what the timelines are meant to do is to provide us with that general overview of this is the story of what happened in this particular revolution. So that if you have questions about that as you're reading, or even before you do any of the readings for the class, you can go and consult those timelines and just have a sense of what the general story is, what the general events were, so that you don't go into our readings completely blind about what those revolutions were all about. All right, look at my notes a little bit here. A few different issues were raised in your questions and in the question that I posed on the discussion board. One of them was about the value of theory, and we kind of tossed that one around a little bit on Twitter. I asked about the difference between theory and conceptual frameworks or concepts. Something I wanted to emphasize here is that something my dissertation advisor told me at one point was that theories are valuable if they add new insights or clarity into the particular historical event that we're studying, or the particular revolution that we're studying in our case. When they kind of muddy the waters and they don't help as much, then that's, again, just something to think about. So I guess my approach to theory is it's helpful as far as it's helpful. It's still important to understand and know the different kinds of social, political, economic theories that different thinkers have put forth over the last couple of centuries, so that we can use those in shaping the way that we think about revolutions and understand the academic debates that are going on about them. But at the end of the day, if those theories don't necessarily help us to better understand revolution, then we should take them with a grain of salt, or kind of devise our own ideas and our own theories about what will best help us to understand the phenomenon of revolution and the historical cases that we'll be looking at. I think the problems with academic theory can be that it can be too dense, too jargony, not really engaged with empirical evidence. I mean, that's kind of at one end of the spectrum. I did have one of my mentors at one point say, because historians aren't really theorists, say that if you're not into theory, it's just because you're too lazy to do the reading. Again, I'm somewhere in between on that spectrum. In terms of defining revolutions, I think there were a few points that all of this kind of raised that would probably have to be included in our class definition of what makes a revolution. Those include the situation or the crises that cause revolution. So as Goldstone put it, a loss of equilibrium. There were other ways of thinking about that in terms of inequalities and class struggle and so on. But there has to be some sort of crisis. That crisis, in order to foment something that's actually a revolution, has to bring about some cross-class alliances. and I think very early on in our Twitter discussions, we mentioned the fact that we can't really think of any examples of lower class revolutions actually succeeding. Revolutions are things that are involve the workers, the kind of lower classes in that regard, as well as the professional class, the middle class. And I defined that term on the discussion board in one of the responses I put there today. But as we see again, some of the terms that I'm using here also need some debate to be defined well. Is this a social revolution? Let me come back to that one. I think the key then is there's some sort of loss of that equilibrium, some sort of crisis. There's cross-class alliance, and there then is a rapid and maybe violent change in government structures. One regime is completely ousted and replaced by another one. And I was thinking, because of some of the comments that a couple of you made, I think it was Jason and Carl made some comments about revolutions being successful, at least in the short term. So I was trying to think about what that might mean. Does that just mean that the revolution unseated the former regime? Is that a success? Or does the revolution have to create some sort of new form of government to replace the old one? I would argue that is the case, but as we'll see, that's not an easy thing to do, and it can often be quite messy. Sometimes when civil wars result from revolutions, it's because of that process of trying to put the state back together again. That's when the civil wars tend to happen. One other element of revolution that many of us noted was that there would be a change to the liberties that citizens are afforded. Or another way that that was spoken of in the readings was that revolutions are about social justice. So again, we'll look for all of those elements as we study our various revolutions. As I've noted in the syllabus and other places, I've tried to create a comparative historical process for us this semester. So rather than just reading each book in its entirety one at a time, we're going to read them together, kind of intertwine different chapters of the different books. So we'll be reading about a couple of different revolutions every week, thinking about different stages in their revolutionary process, but we're also going to be thinking about the different approaches that scholars take toward explaining the historical narrative of revolutions. And so, again, where that will leave us is now we have some tools that we can use, concepts and ideas to think about what makes a revolution, and now we can think about how different scholars have either applied those tools, used different approaches than we've discussed thus far, and what we think about that, what insights that adds, and how that helps us to understand this modern phenomenon of revolution. In one of his posts, Carl looked at the root of the term revolution in the English language, going back to the early 1400s. And something I was thinking about as well, as I read through your responses, is the idea that the term revolution is a fairly modern thing, especially the way that we're using it. The age of revolutions is that period of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the late 1700s. Before that time, that's not to say there wasn't the ousting of governments and replacing of systems of rule, but they weren't referred to as revolutions. When nation states were created, that's when we started talking about revolutions in the way that we're thinking about them now. So again, for whatever, however helpful that might be, something to keep in mind as we move forward with the course. Last thing, I know I've taken too much time. I try not to make super long videos, but I did put a document in the Module 2 readings that's just kind of a list of definitions of revolution from a couple of the people that we read, but also other theorists of revolution like Crane Brinton, Ted Gurr, who have appeared in works like that of Skocpol, just in kind of reference to their work. So I have a handout that I got in my course, my seminar on the Mexican Revolution when I was a grad student. I'll post it again below this video, so maybe we can continue to refer back to it as we continue with the course. I've also set it's a Google Doc so that you can edit it. So if you want to add definitions that were not there. Of course, it's not comprehensive or exhaustive, or if you want to raise questions about definitions as we continue, since we've kind of left that behind in Module 2 to an extent, you can use that document to do so. Hope you're having a great week. You had a nice Labor Day, and I'm looking forward to seeing your timelines.